Greetings everyone, welcome to another episode of Birdsong. I'm your host as always, Kayuda Kiora, and in this episode we are diving into Norse Shamanism with my guest, Imelda Almqvist. Imelda is an international teacher of Sacred Art and Seidr, Old Norse Traditions, which are the ancestral wisdom teachings of Northern Europe. She has published 3 books, Born Shamans, a Spiritual Toolkit for Life, using shamanism creatively with young people of all ages in 2016, Sacred Art, a Hollow Bone for Spirit, where Art Meets Shamanism in 2019, and Medicine of the Imagination, Dwelling in Possibility, an Impassioned Plea for Fearless Imagination in this year, 2020. She has presented her work on both The Shift Network and Sounds True, and she appears in a TV program titled Ice Age Shaman, made for the Smithsonian Museum in the series Mystic Britain, talking about Neolithic Arctic deer shamanism. She is currently finishing up her 4th book about the pre-Christian spirituality of the Netherlands and Low Countries, and she has already started her 5th book about the runes of the Futhark, Uthark. Hopefully my pronunciation is not too off there. Her response to the 2020 pandemic was starting an online school on Teachable called Pregnant Hag Teachings to make more of her classes available online. And you can find out more about Imelda and her work over at her website, which is www.shaman-healer-painter.co.uk. Thank you for being here. Thanks for listening. Let's get into it. Imelda is a wealth of knowledge and wisdom, and I know that you will find value in this episode to carry with you on your own path forward.
Wonderful. Wow.
All right, what are we going to do? Do you want to begin our podcast conversation for our listeners?
Well, you asked about something that is sacred or sacred to me. So I was going to offer to speak an invocation in Old Norse, and that would also then lead us into the Seidr material that you said we would talk about. How about that? What about I speak Sigrdrifa in the invocation? It's not a prayer technically, it's an invocation.
Yeah,
And what I can do, speak it in Old Norse so people can hear what that sounds like, because that's the material we're going to be moving into. And then I can also give the translation, but I'll do that later after I've done the whole thing and not break it up. So shall I do that? And this is a prayer I speak every morning as I speak my day. So that's Heel dager, heelier dag sunir, heel notok niept, oeridem augum, liti okerthinik, okefied sitjondem siger. Heelier is hier, heelaar ozenjeur, heel show in fjol nuta volt. Molok manwit, gevied okker merm tweem, ook leknis hender, medan liefem. And I'll now give you the English translation. It starts with hail day, and that's day capital letter, because day, dager, is a god in the Northern tradition. So every day arrives as a divinity. So you greet the divinity of day. And then you also greet the sons of day. A bit unclear what that is, but that may be like all the days we're going to have on earth. Like every time the sun rises, there is another day. But we also then say hail night and her sister. With benevolent eyes, look upon us and give victory to us sitting here. Hail the gods, hail the goddesses, hail the abundant earth. Elegant speech and practical wisdom, give us healing hands for life. And this material comes from before the 11th century, like it was written down in the 11th century, but it's probably older than that. So it comes to us across more than a millennium of time. That's how old it is, and yet I think fresh.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing to hear you speak that. And this is clearly, as you've stated, one of the ways in which you honor the sacred, remember the sacred within your daily life. So, I mean, to expand out from that, how do you articulate or how do you perceive or feel into what it is that's sacred in your life? And I know what an expansive theme this is, but I would love to hear some more of your reflections on this.
Of course. And yeah, I reflected on that a lot when I wrote my 2nd book, which is called Sacred Art, because I really had a job of defining what would make sacred art different from what we normally call art, modern art, contemporary art. So I had to really sit with that, which has been very, very good. because it's clarified my own thinking. And, you know, also historians of religion have written about it. So big names would be Mircea Eliade or Rudolf Otto, and they've like really sort of dug into this. But I would say that for me, in a way, you could say everything is sacred, and we just lose that awareness sometimes when human beings are born on Earth and we get our ego-led consciousness that is there for very good reason to keep us focused and safe, but we kind of sort of lose touch with our divine origin. So that's one way of putting it. But then I think we have the gift of the sacred constantly piercing our life. It's like always there, if only we focus on it. So for me, the sacred is where the timeless world, the other world, the realm where the gods and the ancestors live, where the great spirits live, where that pierces our life or intersects with our life, so that our material, everyday life here on Earth, you know, suddenly shows its connection to all the other dimensions. And that dimension is always there, but our consciousness cannot constantly tap into that, not when we're solving problems or we're stressed or, you know, we've got to get breakfast on the table. Then we sometimes forget to be in that frame of mind. And I think our daily spiritual practices, like the ones that I teach my students, are really about keeping the window on that dimension open all the time. And then what you get, and this is a teaching from many tribal or indigenous peoples, is that our every act can be or is a sacred act when we do it with the right intention and the right mindset. There is not actually a task we perform in any given day on Earth that cannot have that sacred dimension. You know, like if only we make that our intention and put our consciousness on that.
Yes, intention, sincerity, presence, awareness. These are all some of the qualities that are important for us to bring to be able to tap into more of this sacredness on a moment-to-moment basis.
I agree, yeah.
Well, I definitely want to touch on more of the practicalities about, well, when it comes to tapping into the sacred and perhaps cultivating some more of the capabilities so that we can strengthen our connection to what we might define as the spirit world, where are the ancestors and all our spirit beings, and just to have a more defined or stronger connection to these altered states, shamanic states of consciousness. But we'll get into that later. But some of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast show were because, well, much of your work revolves around sacred art and, of course, the path of shamanism. And, of course, as we know, there are many branches or flavors or textures of shamanism found all across the world, each with their own language, cultural tradition and context, and deities and gods and goddesses, ecological surroundings and nature beings, and so on and so forth. But the path that you teach a lot about is Nordic traditions or Norse shamanism. So I would love to explore this realm of Norse shamanism with you. And I guess a question for you is, what do you find is a reasonable entry point when it comes to offering an introduction into Norse shamanism?
Well, I think to answer that, I have to start with myself because I'm Dutch. So I grew up in the Netherlands and I was brought up a good Roman Catholic girl. Like, my parents were Roman Catholic. So, and that was like the dominant religion in my childhood. I was always having psychic experiences and doing psychopomp work at night. And, it like was always there, the other dimension. And then I met my boyfriend, who's today my husband and father of my 3 children, and he is Swedish. So I made that as a young person, as a 19-year-old, still like a teenager. I made that first trip to Sweden to go visit him in Stockholm, where he was studying. And this was in the middle of winter, so there was a lot of snow and it was very cold. And like walking around in Stockholm, going on my snow walks, the Norse gods just came to attention. So in an antiquarian bookshop, I found a very, very, very old little volume, like a book about the Norse gods and about Norse cosmology in like really antiquated Swedish, but I could read it. And these Norse gods just grabbed me, and they were more real to me almost than the human beings around me. And I had to completely rethink this whole Roman Catholic upbringing, our family being active in the church. And suddenly, like, my reality got pierced, as I say, by this other dimension. And so that's how the Norse gods arrived in my life. And what I ultimately experienced in embracing that and working with that was an incredible sense of homecoming. Because though I've grown up in the Netherlands, I've always felt slightly, what's the word? Out of place, slightly dislocated. Like even as a child, I would wonder where have the mountains gone? And of course, I speak fluent Dutch, but this sounds a bit like strange. I should be speaking another language. And then when I heard the Scandinavian languages, Swedish or Norwegian or Icelandic, my heart would open. I think that is the language of home. So learning Swedish was like wonderful, and it opened up a lot of material because that's closer to the language of my soul. Dutch is my mother tongue, but the Scandinavian languages are the language of my soul. So through engaging with that material, and this went over many years and even decades, and today we have a property in Sweden and a house in the forest where we spend all the holidays, but I also have a school there, a school building, and not now during the pandemic, but normally speaking, people come to Sweden to be on that land and to be in deep communication with the land. And essentially, for me, it was that I experienced such a sense of homecoming when I found like my true home within the world of spirituality, where I discovered where I belonged and like what my true land is and how that land communicates with me, that the next obvious step was to bring other people home. And also I would speak about it and people would say, that sounds amazing. I want to have that experience. When are you going to be teaching on that land? And that took a number of years to manifest. But now and then we all got it sorted and the pandemic came. So at the moment I have a large group of students from all over the world. We're just counting the days until they can be there again and continue our work. But we've had to delay everything by a year for pandemic reasons. But we're using that year really well to sort of do a lot of like deepening exercises, and we're doing webinars. But so for me, that would be the word. I had a spiritual homecoming, and it was so life-changing that I wanted to facilitate that experience for other people. And many people, because there's been, human beings have always traveled, so there's been such a diaspora. But many people actually have Scandinavian or Northern European or even Western European ancestry. So I find that there are very many people, like really large numbers of people, who contact me and say, well, my grandfather was Norwegian, or my mother was like Dutch, but came to the US or to New Zealand or to Australia as a child. And I now really feel the call, like the ancestors are singing in my blood. I feel the call to discover what that means. Yeah, and that's where such an introduction course, as you described, comes in. Because there is so much material. And also you need to meet people on the level where they are. You can't jump in at the deep end. So I've put a lot of work into putting together introduction courses that give people all the basics, and it also helps them navigate it and map. If I find this interesting, there I can find more information. So that's part of my life's work.
When you're speaking about people feeling as though their ancestry are speaking to them or whispering to them, I've explored quite a few branches of shamanism and nature-based spirituality myself, some more so on a superficial cognitive level, others more on a deeply embodied level. But part of my ancestry is English, Irish, Danish, and there's Finnish in there as well, with a couple of other bloodlines that go throughout Europe. And it's one of the reasons that I was excited to talk to you as well, Imelda, because this is something that I would love to explore on a deeper level, Norse spirituality and Norse shamanism. So I've also heard you use the phrase in a previous talk. I think you said something to the degree of you were painting your way onto the path or something. So where did painting kind of come into the picture when it comes to the intersection of shamanism as well?
Well, that's easily explained because I was an art student. I told you I went to Stockholm as a 19-year-old, but I didn't say I was an art student in Amsterdam at that time. So I was in my second year, or I think it was this. Yeah, I was in my second year of art school. And so painting is like, another sort of primary language. Like I think in images, or I often work something through in a painting before I'll put it into words. So when these Norse gods grabbed me, my response to that was painting them. And then through painting them, I realized that these stories opened up. As you say, it wasn't just a cognitive, knowledge-based process anymore of, oh yeah, I now know what the story is about this god. But it became a lived process. Like it's like art very much became a portal where I painted my way into the material, and I started having direct interactions with these gods and got quite emotional about that. I remember I was making a painting about that in the Northern tradition, or in the Norse stories, the god Baldr, who's the god associated with the sun. He's the most beautiful, the brightest god. He dies a very sad death, which of course has to happen because the sun has to set every day and rise again the next morning. So from a cosmological point of view, it makes sense. But I was like so upset about that. I was in tears. My then boyfriend, now husband, sort of came home, and I was like, what had happened that I was so upset? Well, all I had done was connected to this really old story, but it had touched me on the level of soul, and it had opened all these doors within me. And I'd made this painting about that, and I'd been off the planet for most of the day. I'd been in another world, and when he came home from university or whatever, like I had to come back and bring myself back to the physical room we were in Stockholm, So that was that. So it started there. Then also, as you go through life, it's not immediately, at least in my life, it wasn't immediately clear what I was going to be doing. There were many things I found interesting. And, I had a number of jobs, trained as an art therapist, but that wasn't quite it. I didn't like the boundaries placed around that profession. It was too limiting. Then I became a mother of 3 young children. We had 3 children over the space of 4 years. So I was pretty busy there for a while, like running after toddlers. But then through my paintings, and I would do open studios and exhibitions and art commissions. And one day a woman came to an open studio I did in my house in London. And she said, do you realize that your paintings are the paintings of a shaman? I said, like, have you done shamanic training, or are you going to do shamanic training? And that was like, it was one of these comments that kind of like opened something, because I said, no, like I have 3 really young children. I can't go all the way to the Amazon or Siberia. And she said, no, like these days you can do these courses also in the UK. You don't have to go all the way to the other side of the world. So then I found a teacher in core shamanism, because I wanted to do some structural learning. And also still, even after she came, I still thought, oh, interesting, and got busy with the children again. But one night, the spirits pinned me down and said, we've been trying to get through to you. You're not responding. So let us be very clear now. And this was like, 20 years ago. But the funniest thing is they used words like Google. They said that, like you have to go on your computer tomorrow, and then you like Google, use your search engine, and you have to like find a teacher. You have to find shamanic training. And by then I had read all these books about anthropology, because that's one of my great interests. I'm always like reading books about other cultures and anthropology books. And what I had picked up from these books, though it had only been cognitive, was that if the call to be a so-called, I can't call myself a shaman, I'm not a shaman, but from these books, that if in the tribe the call to be a shaman comes, if the person doesn't answer that or respond, they're going to have a series of ill fortune. They're going to have like accidents and illnesses until they get the message. So I had read so many anthropology books. I thought, okay, this message has come 3 times now. There were a few other things. But it was that, the spirits, the woman, 1 or 2 other things. And I sort of thought, I know that if I don't listen to this and open this door, this will keep on coming to attention, but not in a gentle way. So I just thought, well, I have no other choice. I have to do this now. So I embarked on this great adventure, and then ended up training in core shamanism, because that was realistic in the UK, not wanting to leave my very young children for very young, while they were very young. And then eventually, that was interesting, and it gave me a very good set of basic tools. It was really useful, but it was very clear to me that for me, my home base was north. And then the challenge became finding my way back home. And all that Norse material that had always been there, Northern tradition material, but now with the new toolkit I had learned, reading all that material again, all the old texts, and then understanding what is actually going on there on the level, the shamanic level, the level of altered states of consciousness, on the level of healing, on the way, like, we work our magic with reality. So I sort of digressed away from the Northern tradition a bit, because there just wasn't anything available in the UK at that time. And then I made my way back. So again, there's been that feeling of homecoming. So it's been quite a long journey, but yeah, in many ways, and it all came through my paintings. I was reading the anthropology books to get ideas for really good paintings. And then these paintings became portals I used to dive into the spirit world. So I painted my way in many ways.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So, with your studies in core shamanism as taught by the likes of Sandra Ingerman or Michael Harner, for our listeners who aren't familiar, and then transitioning to Norse traditions, Norse spirituality, Norse shamanism, I would love to ask what are perhaps some of the notable differences or similarities, or just that transition from core shamanism into more of a Norse path of shamanism?
I think that's a really big topic. It's something, again, I've given a lot of thought. And I would say that I think core shamanism has been a lifesaver for many people because Michael Harner kind of put that together. And the idea was to teach like the principles that united all like tribal or indigenous forms of shamanism, and so create a toolkit offered to people in Western culture again, so they could start using these tools, but stripped kind of their cultural context, which is controversial. You know, until today, some people say Harner gave the world the greatest gift, and other people said, well, that gets very close to countercultural appropriation. And I'm not going to sort of, enter that whole debate today. That, you could talk about that for days.
Sure.
But that's what Michael Harner did. And he was the founder of that, and he founded the Foundation of Shamanic Studies. And then there have been other teachers, most notably Sandra Engelman, who was one of my teachers because I did shamanic teacher training with her in the US and worked, closely together with her. She actually wrote the foreword for my first book very kindly. So, and what then Sandra Engelman did is she brought back soul retrieval that had not been in the toolkit that Michael Harner came up with. So she added soul retrieval, which is a very key thing in shamanic healing work. And since, other people have, a lot of people who've trained in core shamanism come from other practices, like I came from painting and art therapy. And, people come from the medical profession, or they're vets, or they're osteopaths. So a lot of people have used that material and taken it into their own profession, and that's made the whole profession wider again. I think for me, the thing ultimately with core shamanism is because it's a set of principles that's become divorced from its origin. That was the whole key idea. I find that when I work with material that is ancestral, that comes from the land I walk on, and in that land are the bones of our ancestors, and not just our human ancestors, our tree and animal ancestors as well. And I find that with an ancestral spirituality, there is a level of detail, but there's also, again, that feeling of homecoming again, because on that land, as I said, the voices of the ancestors still live in birdsong, in the way the wind rustles in the trees, in the way the colors of the flower and the smells in summer and the snow in winter. And, and it's very, very sensual. And the connection with our ancestors becomes very physical through our own having a body on earth. And also through our connection to them, through us, they get to have that experience again. If we connect with them for a moment, they can gain access to our senses. And also we remember them. And the word remember means to put back together after it had been taken apart. So through remembering them, they kind of live on here on earth because we honor them. So to cut a long story short, for me, it wasn't realistic anymore to have a spirituality that was cut off from what my ancestors did, and that from my point of view puts too little focus on shadow work and ancestral healing work. Because when I started doing shamanic healing work with people for many years, I was a practitioner of shamanic healing work. And it very soon became clear that ancestral healing work and ancestral lineage healing work and more shadow work had to be added to the toolkit I had already received from my own teachers, and that people were not going to make the progress they could be making unless those things were explored. So for a while there, I became a teacher of ancestral healing work. That became quite a big thing. Does that explain it?
It does. And that's a great point that you raise as well. Yes. So to kind of keep deepening into this path of exploring Norse shamanism, I know that you've mentioned that your teachings closely follow these two ancient texts. And I don't know how to pronounce this word, so you can clarify it for me, Imelda, but there's the
Poetic Edda and the Prose
Edda
Edda,
and the
I
Prose
think you mean.
Edda. Yeah, that
Yeah.
is exactly what I mean. So I'm curious to have you expand a little bit on what these Eddas are.
Well, the Eddas are the written texts we have in the Northern tradition. We also have a whole body of other material. We have like Baldr and we have like Runic material and grimoires. But the key text, are those Eddas. And what they are is that in Scandinavia, bearing in mind Finland is not part of Scandinavia and has a non-Scandinavian language. So I prefer speaking of the Nordic region, also including Finland and Iceland. Most people think all of that is Scandinavia. It actually isn't. So let's call it the Nordic region and include Finland and Iceland as well, and even parts of Greenland, like the culture of Greenland is in there. So the Nordic region then had a very strong oral tradition. So they had a lot of poetry. And the reason that these texts are in poetic form with a lot of like repetition and also a lot of like kennings, these are like, like metaphors and symbols, was to make it easy for the audience to remember, both that when a storyteller, a skald, started telling their story, that people would know what story they were on. Like children, they can relate, they've heard the story before. But also, if something has repetition and these kinds of like, really interesting plays of word, it becomes easier to remember. So that's a feature of an oral tradition, makes it easier for people to hold on to that. And of course, still, every skald who tells the story will tell it differently. It's a living tradition as well. But then what happened is that Europe further south was Christianized about by the year 500. And then there was also the invasion, like the Roman Empire became really big. So there was that influence as well. That never reached Scandinavia. It stopped sort of at the Rhine, passing through the Netherlands and Germany. But Christianity reached Scandinavia, and Scandinavia sort of by the year 1000. And by the 11th century, Scandinavia, or actually the Nordic region, even Iceland, was fully Christianized. And then what happened is that there were people, one man in particular, his name was Snorri Sturluson, and he was a chieftain, and Kudi in Iceland, like a chief of his like clan, a spiritual and political leader. And he had the idea of writing these texts down because he must have realized that with Christianity becoming so dominant that the older culture, like it was at risk of being forgotten and dropping into oblivion. So he started writing that down. So we have fragments of texts that come from an earlier time there were other people as well who wrote some of that down, but they all have their own filters of perception. So Snorri wrote the he wrote the Prose Edda, like he wrote it all down, and then we have like the Poetic Edda as well. And these two books together, which essentially cover the same material, give us that material. But the thing is, because Snorri Sturluson in Iceland, he was a Kudi, he was a chieftain, Iceland had already become Christianized. And, he definitely was a Christian himself. He possibly even was a Christian leader. So not only did he write it from the point of view, it's more like when you write about the stories from your ancestors, but you yourself believe something else. But also as a Christian, he tried to tidy the material up. So like he put sort of things in there to make it all a bit tamer or a bit more like acceptable to Christianity. So he had to tame the goddess Freya down quite a lot. Freya is this war goddess, love goddess, fertility goddess. That was all a bit too wild. So the thing is that we're very lucky to have these two books, to have these two texts. And there's some amazing like poems in there, the Voluspa, which are the sayings of the Vulva or the prophetess, or the Hovamol, the sayings of Odin. And it's an immense gift that we have these texts and that we can still like read them. And they exist as published books today. They can be ordered through bookstores, and also they can be found online. Some organizations make the material available online so people can engage with it straight away. Wonderful as that is, the work we need to do is like being aware of the cultural filter that Snorri and also some other people had, like when they wrote that. And there was also like a man in Denmark called Saxo Grammaticus, and I think he was a Christian like bishop, or he was in the church. So he wrote down the old material, but in a very disapproving way. He took a very dim view. So the thing is, we need to be grateful for what we have, but we can't just take it on wholesale and say this is like the gospel, this is like the Bible, and we follow it exactly. It is the work of human beings who are pushing their own political agenda and who are pushing their own spiritual belief.
So I don't know if this is going to be a silly question or perhaps it has an obvious answer, but I'll put it forth anyway. So with the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, is the reason that a lot of your teachings are arising from these two texts because they closely follow or they have fragments or even quite in-depth pieces when it comes to a lot of Norse shamanism, such as the trance prophecy and the oracular work and the runic carvings and all of the magical chants and songs and so on and so forth?
Well, that is exactly right. I mean, there are like texts, in the Edda, like the prophetic Edda opens with the voluspa, and that means the sayings of the prophetess, the words of the vulva, like the vulva speaks. And she's like the primordial, the first ever vulva. And as a prophetess, she sees like what is going to unfold. So she gives this whole description of a world that's come into being. And also she was around before the gods. What we know as the Norse gods arrived much later on the scene, but there were like earlier beings, and she talks about those. And then we have like the Norns, obviously, who like carved the fates of all human beings. So all of these key characters we meet there. And then there are like rune poems where, Odin really talks about the runes, and there are like 18 runes he talks about in detail what they are for. So rune magicians today, and I teach classes for rune magicians, they go back to these texts. And they find a lot of it like starter information. It's not complete, but I think the fact that it's not complete is great because sometimes people get in a mindset of, oh, if only we could live in the 9th century in Scandinavia or the Nordic region again. Well, A, that's not possible. B, like when we think that that's a romantic filter, there were a lot of things going on in that time that we maybe do not want to introduce into the time that we live in. So I think that is not a tenable thing, or then, maybe you get into the sort of area of more reenactment or whatever. But I think if it is to be a living spirituality for us today, a really key piece is the personal relationship, the personal or direct revelation. And that's one of the things that I took away from working with teachers such as Sandra Ingemann or Simon Buxton, my own teachers in core shamanism, that we do not need only these texts. It's wonderful we have these texts that give us wonderful flavor and a lot of material to work with. But with my students, I use these texts, but then also we get active. Like I'll tell them, I read out to them the sayings of the prophetess, the Voluspa, but then we'll do a high seed ceremony and I'll tell them the technicalities of that and how that works. And everyone gets to go on the high seed if I do it with students. Everyone gets to have that experience of taking the role of the vulva and sort of being that mouthpiece for spirit where, the vulva or whatever deity they are connecting with speaks through them. And people absolutely love that. They can't get enough of that. They always ask how soon they can do another high seed. So it's really powerful work. But I think it's very important that, as you said earlier, it would be very easy if you're only going to be reading the Eddas, you can remain stuck on a cognitive level where you acquire a lot of information. And interesting as that is, it doesn't necessarily become a lived or embodied process. So the work I'm trying to do as a teacher of that material, I try to offer both. I try to give a good underpinning into like the theory and the sort of, like the material we have left. But once my students have absorbed that, we do high seeds, we sit out on grave mounds in Scandinavia, we do this sort of direct work. And then what the students receive from that and share in class really pads out the larger picture of what's going on. And that's also why I think some people think it's so sad that because of the arrival of Christianity and the very active, aggressive Christianization. It is true, a lot of material was lost. There is no two ways about that. And some people think that, if only we could get all of that back and it would be complete. I personally think it's not as simple as that, because I think it's in the gaps, it's in the places, the material we don't have is the invitation for us to arrive at our contemporary relationship to the material. And also that material comes from somewhere. There would have been shamans, or, in the Northern tradition, you speak of a Seid mother or a Seid kuna, or a vulva, who would have been a mouthpiece for that material to start with. So if we can use those same shamanic techniques to have that direct interaction, then we can maybe not bring back exactly what they had, but what we can bring is the material and the teachings most needed for our time.
Yes, that all makes complete sense and many important points there. And I think perhaps if that's hard to say, but I can see the perspective that if we did have access to all of the old texts in their completion, then there could be the rut to fall into where it was perceived or approached with this very linear mind, and that could be at the risk of that direct revelation through nature and spirit, which is, as you say, what shamanism is all about. And it's fantastic that it's all written down, but that's fodder for the mind, really. I mean, it's all about having that direct personal experience ourselves.
Yeah, it gives a context, it gives a starting point. It also gives, because it said these concepts or these beings, like every single one of them is a portal, and people can either, sit out, or people can use art. Like I do sort of hybrid courses, marrying Northern tradition work to art, and people sort of love painting their way right in and seeing what they find. But, all of these things that we have, I more see it as portals. We step through them, and we ourselves explore what is behind, the hidden realms behind those portals. And then we bring that back, and then we share that with others. And a lot of my students are like doing that as well in their own ways. A lot of my students are, they have their own like podcast, or they're writing a book, or they have a blog, or, it's more like, and then they're giving like their discoveries, their take on what's going on. And that's like really beautiful to see. And I think if, as you say, the Northern tradition, if everything had been preserved and written down, it would become very prescriptive. And then, and I think it can be like that with the greatest respect, but in other religions, like say, when I hear about Talmudic scholars who have to commit huge amounts of text to memory, and you can't really go outside that, like you have to stick within it. I think that scholarship is like beautiful, and there is immense wisdom in that tradition. So all respect for that. But I personally am happy that I found my home in a tradition where there is scope for direct relationship, and where it is not wrong to say, well, the god Thor came to me yesterday and he shared this amazing piece of information with me, and that students can talk to each other like that and share that, because it's also, how do you say, not all scholars of religion are going to agree with this, but there's this idea, once upon a time it was all written down, and now this is this sort of holy scripture that we have. But I personally believe that the gods continue to evolve through their relationship with human beings, and that is not actually one-way traffic. We often think, we humble human beings, and then there are the gods, and yes, we need to be humble because they're greater than us. But I also very strongly get a guidance. It's through interaction with human beings over many centuries that these gods reach their full manifestation, and that they are on a spiritual journey of their own, where they continue to evolve. I do not see deities as frozen entities. I see them very much as evolving beings that I'm in relationship with, if that makes sense.
It does make sense, and I'm familiar with these lived and embodied concepts primarily through tuning into the work of Dr. Martin Shaw, who you may be familiar with, who touches a lot on the mythologies being alive, having their
Wonderful.
own essence to them, and evolving as we evolve. So yeah, I'm familiar with those ideas, and I understand them on an embodied level, and I share similar views.
I will need to check out his work. That sounds fantastic.
He does. He has some very, very fantastic work. There's a couple of things that I wanted to touch on, and something you mentioned, which was sitting on the grave mounds, which I think people are going to be very interested in. I mean, I'm interested in it, so I'd love you to speak a little bit more on that. Maybe we'll start there.
Okay, well, it is very much a Northern tradition thing. Like, I know that, say, a Native American thing would be like to be in a sweat lodge or things like that, or like people go to South America and they try ayahuasca. And people often like ask me, like, do we need ayahuasca, or is it a good idea to have sweat lodges, say, in the Netherlands or in Sweden? And what I always say is, like, I'm not going to tell anyone not to do anything, but in my opinion, and this is only an opinion, Northern Europe has its own equivalents of those things. So to speak, from my point of view, we don't need ayahuasca or sweat lodges. Like, our own tradition offers things, and also things that belong to our ancestors. So there is no accusation of countercultural appropriation, which I think is the beauty of it. So in the Northern tradition, utiseta, that is the Northern word for sitting out, sitting on the land, is a really big thing. It's as big as in core shamanism, you'd speak of shamanic journeys. And where it comes from, I was talking earlier about, the great text, the Voluspa, and we have this primordial, original, first vulva who then speaks her prophecies. And then later on, and she was there at the beginning of time. So the Norse gods arrive later, like Odin and Thor and Freya and Frigg. And Odin, who is always on a quest for knowledge, like, he's like addicted to learning more. He has this habit of waking up vöulur, that is the plural of vulvas. So I can say vulvas. So there are places in the land where we know that these ancient, powerful vulvas, these prophetesses, these seeresses are buried. And then Odin is described in the great poems and some song cycles of going there, and he wakes them up. So he'll go to a place where a vulva is buried in her grave, and he will make a great deal of noise until she wakes up and kind of sits up and talks to him, and not always gracefully. Like, the vulva doesn't always like being woken by Odin. So he will ask his questions. Like, for instance, I talked about the cult Baldr, who had, in the text, Baldr's Draumer, the dreams of Baldr. Baldr dreams that he's going to die, and indeed he does die, and it cannot be prevented. But then in that interval before he actually dies, like Odin, his father, wants to sort of, see, is there some way of changing this fate? Is there some way of preventing this? So Odin goes and wakes up Vulvas, Völur, and then he gets this information, and but also learns that what the Norns carve, the fates, the Norns, like, we cannot always change. We have to roll with what they carve, or with what they write for human beings, what they weave. So this whole idea then is that by sitting on a grave mound, that the people who are in the land of the dead, our own ancestors, or even the great spirits on the other side, that because they've stepped outside the time-space continuum where you and I are talking right now, like, we are confined within time and space and physical matter, per definition of what we're doing. Mm-hmm. And that the beings who are outside time, which is one way of defining people who are or souls beings in the other world, is that they will have the bird's eye perspective. They have a larger picture of what's going on Earth, because they are not limited the way we are in our perception. So the whole concept of sitting out could be that you go and sit out on a, like, say, a grave mound where a powerful figure is buried, and there are grave mounds all over Scandinavia. And by sitting out in a humble way, and ideally sitting out through the night when it gets dark and there are no other distractions, is that you would be in communication with the person buried in that grave mound, and that you would receive privileged information, guidance on your own life, maybe guidance on the pandemic. We have the coronavirus or whatever. And then we would take that information away from the encounter. But like, a similar thing can also be done with our own ancestors, like, because we now have Christian graveyards, but once upon a time, people were more buried like on the land. So people who had like land or a small holding, there would be a small cemetery there. So the ancestors would be buried like closer to where the current generations live on the homestead. And then, if you're really stuck with, say, bad news has befallen the family, or someone is really sick, or, you're these situations, then what you would do as the spiritual person, or maybe the head of the family, or the female head of the family, you would go and sit out on the graves of your ancestors and say, please, I need guidance, I need insights as to what's going on, I need to make decisions on how I'm going to lead my family through this. And then you would sit out, and then hopefully some useful information would come. And also in Europe in general, I'll just say this because people don't realize this, but up to the 10th or 11th century, people made a habit of having like picnics and meals in graveyards, even in Christian graveyards, because at that time of year, which, like called Halloween or Samhain, or in the Northern tradition, the Alpha Bloods, at that time of year, the veil between the worlds was thin, and people saw it as their duty to go and feed the ancestors. But the Christian church really stomped on that. It was highly inappropriate to have picnics and meals, or children running around graveyards while the parents are, eating. And, the church just thought that was completely out of the question. So they forbid that, and they imposed really big fines and all of it because they were afraid of it. But I think the result of that has been that in North and Western Europe, the whole tradition of ancestral veneration, honoring the ancestors and still finding ways of being in communication with them and acknowledging they're still involved with how we do, and they're tied to the well-being of the land we're on and all beings, which is a very tribal teaching. That, you can see the point in history where that was it was stomped out. And fortunately now there are people, there is myself and many others, who are now really promoting that again, not the picnics in graveyards, but the people who are really teaching how important it is to have that relationship with our ancestors. And teachers such as my colleague Daniel Four, who teaches ancestral healing work and focuses on that, they're making a very valuable contribution because they're telling people again, how this is done and how important it is to have a living connection to the ancestors. Because in our culture, you say, oh, well, they're long dead. Why should I care? Well, you wouldn't be here today if they hadn't given you the gift of life. And also a lot of the things that you think of as yours come from them originally. Your children may have their hands and feet. You may have their eye color. You may have their good brain or interest in something. The notion that we can live cut off from the ancestors, I think, is a very damaging notion, and it doesn't lead to good outcomes if you see how we look after the land in generally in the world today.
Yes, I'm familiar with some of Daniel Four's work. I've read his book, Ancestral Medicine, I believe is the title, and explored various ritualized meditations and ceremonial offerings when it comes to connecting with ancestors. And on that note of sitting on the grave mounds, I see similarities here when it comes to perhaps other traditions like the Native American vision quest, or maybe the Australian walkabout. It's just being out on the land, and it's calling for a vision. It's seeking a vision. It's almost like a divination or divinatory experience in one sense.
It is, yeah.
And then, when I'm thinking about divination, I'm thinking about the rune stones, which we briefly touched on as well, which is a big part of the Nordic tradition. And then I think about the similarities across various shamanic traditions then, perhaps in various aspects of, let's say, African tradition, they've got the bone throwing, or maybe a more contemporary kind of modality, or it might be something like tarot or like pulling cards or something like that, So I don't know, maybe there's a question in here about the rune stones. What is it about the divination through rune stones that speak so much to you? Because I know I've seen some of your videos, and you spoke about your forest abode, and I seen the video where you took people, where you showed people around the forest, and you had all the masks on the trees, and then got the runes on your on one of your drums. You've got your rune drum, and then you've got your rocks all around your property, and you take some time to chant or to say the names of the runes. So I guess I'd just love to hear a little bit more about your relationship with the runes.
With the runes. Yes, well, what I'd first like to say is that technically speaking, in Scandinavia, in Sweden in particular, we have a lot of rune stones, just to clear up possible confusion. But a rune stone commonly is a large memorial stone, like a standing stone, like taller than me, erected in the landscape, and it has an inscription. So say in like even Scandinavia, even as it goes into Christian times, then the runes are used like they're Christian messages written in the runes. So that happens as well. It's more like so and so erected this rune stone to mark the passing of their dear son who died in battle or whatever it was. So when we say rune stone, we most commonly think of these standing stones in the landscape.
Okay.
And I have a YouTube video where I visit such a stone and tell people what the inscription actually says. People really want to see an example of that. But then we also have the runes, more like, as rune magicians use them, where we have the 24 runes of the elder Futhark. They are the ones that are most commonly used, and they're the ones that I teach to my students. Though as being Dutch, I also work with the Frisian runes. I have another rune set I work with, but we can leave that out for now, more focus on the Nordic stuff. So, the runes, they are a very magical tradition. And because Odin talks about them in these texts I mentioned earlier, they're like really, really ancient. They go a long way back. And what are the runes? Well, the runes are not just symbols, but I really see them as living beings that come forward to help us in our lives. So when we make a rune set and we make all 24 runes of the elder Futhark, then all of them together make a circle. And then by pooling runes, it becomes another divination device. So like I have my bag of runes here. Well, I think the viewers won't see that. You can see it, but this is my pouch with the runes. It's never far off. And so it's like a divination device. If you're really, really stuck, you can do a rune reading. You pull these runes out of a pouch, or you have your client do that. And then you interpret, you allow the runes to speak. So, in a way, it's almost like oracular work done properly. You don't just go with the meanings according to the book or according to the rune poems, which we also find in the Nordic region. But a really good rune magician has a personal relationship with the indwelling spirits of all runes. So when you do a rune reading for someone, you see far more than those basic meanings. There's like a picture that forms, and then that allows you to give a person guidance. Or it's not so much the sort of prediction. That's another thing people think, that divination is predicting the future. The thing about the future is that all of us are co-creating it all of the time, and human beings have free will, meaning there are many, many possible outcomes for any situation, depending on what we choose to create and co-create. So you can't use the runes to say there's one definite future we're going to predict. That does not exist. So the runes for me are more about that they help you map the choices that have already been made or the events that have already played out. So you start seeing like the underlying things, the underlying picture, and then based on those choices and events, you can make more of a qualified guess about what is shaping up in what we call the future. But also the future in the Northern tradition, people often say that the Norns, the three fates, symbolize the past, the present, and the future. And it is said that Odin received the gift of the runes from the same Norns. So there is a connection there. But actually, when you look at what those names really mean, that is not straightforward. It's too simplistic to say past, present, future. And the Norn that's commonly said to represent the future, her name is Skuld. Skuld doesn't actually mean future. It means debt in the sense of that which is being owed. So future, if you go with the Norn Skuld, really means what we still need to balance. So it's not future in our culture of like all the things that are going to happen from this moment in time onward. Because also when we do this work, we step outside time, and you see that time is like more of an illusion. And I actually think that that is really beautiful, because it also brings our responsibility as practitioners, that it's not just, we have a wide open future to do as we like. No, we are here on earth at this point in time in this location, and the Norns will draw our attention back to that question. Here in this location in our life, with the skill set I have, what requires balancing? What is the healing or balancing work I need to do? And I think that's a better sort of concept of the future, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it makes sense. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I'm asking about the runes because I guess I have an interest as well to learn more about this living technology, if you will.
I like that. Living technology. I'll quote you to my students in the next room class. That's good.
For sure. And, I have a feeling that there are listeners or viewers that have some interest in learning more about the ins and outs of Norse spirituality or traditional shamanism. So, what might be a good resource for myself and for other people to go off and look into and learn more about the runes?
Well, there are some books out there by a man. Well, his books are under the pseudonym Edred Thursson. His real name is Stephen Flowers. I mean, he's come out since, and we now know his real name.
Mm-hmm.
And though he's become quite a controversial figure for reasons I'm not going to go into, I would still say that the books that he got out there, which is like a handbook for rune magicians, the runes of the Elder Futhark, I can't remember the exact title, but if you type in Edred Thursson and the runes, at least 3 books will come up. And I still think they make a good starting point. He's also got some things in there that I'm not completely mad about, like yoga positions for all the runes. I mean, to my best knowledge, the Vikings or the people of the Old Norse period didn't do yoga. So I think there's some questionable things in there as well. But still, he did a lot of research, and these books make a good starting point. And then there's a guy in Scandinavia as well called Thomas Carlson, who also writes about his way of working with the runes. And then things get really, really complicated because Edred Thursson or Stephen Flowers, he talks about the runes of the Futhark. Now, the Futhark is named for the first 6 letters. If you look at the runes of the Elder Futhark, the letters go Futhark. But in Scandinavia, someone floated a few centuries ago the idea that, Scandinavia, like many places in the world, had a period of witch trials and witch hunts. And the people who were the wisdom keepers at that time were in a position where they had to sort of hide some material in such a way it could be found again by future generations, because it was no longer safe to be, to be known for practicing for that material. And also there was a risk of Christianity stomping things out to the point where, as I said, it went into oblivion and we couldn't pull it back. So the idea has been floated, I buy into it, and some people don't, that actually the order of the Elder Futhark, which is based on the rune stones in Scandinavia, where do we get the order from these big standing stones, also picture stones in Scandinavia. So there is some debate about the correct sequence of the runes. But the idea is there that if you think of all the runes as not linear, but as a circle, it's like a dial, say for your thermostat or for your washing machine, and that earlier rune magicians at some point turned the dial by 1 position, meaning that the final rune of the Futhark became the first one. So the F, which is rune Fe or Feo, Fehu, it appears first, as we know the Futhark or in academic texts, but some rune magicians have said if you look at all the sort of correspondences and what really goes on in the story that all the runes tell together, then, the circle of the runes really start at the next one, which is Ur or Urus. And then if you do that, you end up with a sequence called the Uthark. I mean, this guy is Scandinavian, Uthark, or he would say Uthark because he's Swedish, Thomas Carlson. So he's written a book called The Night Side of the Runes and then working with the Uthark. So in that book, he explains why the dial needs to be turned back and then what kind of correspondences you get. And it's very, very interesting because I've done it both ways. Also when I teach my students, I don't want to indoctrinate them. I just want to tell them what's available and encourage them to make up their own mind. And with my advanced students, I've taken them through it. If you put a Futhark with the F up, so to speak, where Fe is the first letter, then you get a number of, because then you get numerology as well and all the key positions and the meanings of that. And also in that is quite, so you find a lot of male chords and it's quite masculine. And what you find, if you dial it 1 back and you put it on Uthark with the U in the north at the top, then you get a lot more deeply feminine correspondences. So a lot of my female rune magician students really run with that. They think that is fantastic. So I'll just sort of, this is a bit more advanced, but just to sort of say, if you're looking for good authors, these are some people I would look into. I do find that people say that, yeah, you can't learn the runes from a book alone because it doesn't come alive. You get all, it's cognitive. So at the moment, I'm also teaching a 1-year program for aspiring rune magicians where we're going for all the runes. So I've just done 2 sessions out of 9. And that is, a lot of people there have already worked with the runes, but they say the portals just haven't opened. It hasn't become a, an embodied sort of personal relationship thing. And that's what I'm working with my students on. I take them through these portals, set them homework, and I get them working with the material.
Yeah, that's all great. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So one thing that you mentioned before, Imelda, was ayahuasca, buzzword in the
Yeah.
contemporary field of shamanism and nature-based spirituality. But when it comes to Norse shamanism and the connection with plant or fungi-based shamanism, what is there that you know of? I mean, a lot of people will probably be familiar with the Viking berserkers and perhaps Amanita muscaria.
Yeah, the Amanita muscaria, that's the red mushroom with the white
Sure.
dots. And it is known that the Vikings laced their meat with Amanita muscaria.
Okay.
And that would have brought on a mildly altered state of consciousness, of course, depending on what dose you do it and also how you prepare the mixture. So that is known. And there's still people until today who work with that. And then also the Amanita then sort of links to like the reindeer peoples who used to, like say the Sami peoples in northern Scandinavia, Nordic region, who would collect the urine of reindeer, and then from there, like put that into their food and drink, like that. They would prepare it properly because because it passed through the reindeer, some of the more toxic and dangerous aspects were filtered out, and then what you kept in the right dose was a mind-altering substance. So if you're looking, and there are like other things as well, because you have plants, and of course you have toxic plants that could be used in smaller doses. So in Scandinavia we find the usual candidates, such as like black henbane and things like that. So it wasn't only mushrooms or like plants as well. But I certainly would say that this region, and there's lots of fungi in Scandinavia, that this region very much had its own psychotropic substances. And then, in terms of like, why would I not do an ayahuasca ceremony? Or I think my issue with that is that ayahuasca belongs to a very particular continent, and also it is deeply sacred. When the people there use it, it's a sacred ceremony, and the space is held by an elder. And also, like, the ancestors are called. So the living elders and the dead elders, who are the ancestors, kind of like hold space for that. And and then it's a very, very beautiful and deeply sacred thing. My concern is that people now take these substances and bring it to Europe and run ayahuasca ceremonies in church basements or village halls or whatever, often also with the idea of making some money from that. And like, for me, the issue then becomes the ancestors again, because if it's not held by the elders and the ancestors, and also if energetically speaking, there is a motive of hosting such a thing for money, so the energy of money and wanting to make a profit comes into it, which is not originally wired into that ceremony, like, how safe is that then? I personally, as a shamanic practitioner in London, have been approached way too many times to do a clean up thing with a person who's in a mental hospital with ayahuasca-induced psychosis. So personally speaking, I'll be honest, I'm not very keen on it, and also that's work I do not like doing. And I've had to sort of work with people who've been in a ayahuasca-induced psychosis, and that's not pretty work. That's not easy work to be doing from a healing point of view. And it's not my favorite kind of work. I'd rather work with children or people who are dying. So I would then say, if our own area has its own plants, and just as we have human ancestors, we also have plant ancestors, and these things grow around us. They're part of our natural environment, and on that land, and the bones of our ancestors are in that land. Our land, in a very deep way, consists of all the beings who have died before we arrived on the scene. So when we walk on land, we literally walk on the bodies of all the beings who came before us. So for me, to use substances, or if you're now gonna, because I think there's also ways of altering your consciousness without using any substances at all. And I think that's one of the gifts of core shamanism, that from my point of view, it's not necessary to use substances. There are many perfectly safe ways of doing that. I never use substances on my sacred art courses, or when I do a high seed or rune magician courses. Like, there are other ways of doing it that pose absolutely no risk. But if you now are a person who really feels that's the path you want to take, and you want to work with intoxicating or even toxic substances, I would then say, like, do it in the place where your ancestors are. If that's not possible, because people travel and are all over the world, look for something that is supported by the land that you're currently living on, and then really call in, have an elder supervise it, or the closest you can get to an elder in our culture, and call in the ancestors to sort of, hold space for you and be in a circle around you. So that's my personal opinion on that.
Yeah, there is certainly the tendency for many people to be drawn towards the outer husk of traditions that may seem enticing or enchanting or shimmering, glittery from the outside, but there's often that lack of the cultural context for those stepping into traditions outside of their own blood ancestry or the lands on which they live. So bridging that gap to, I guess, to illuminate the essence of what shamanism is all about and integrating that in a way that is appropriate can certainly be a bit of a challenge, because we know that the Western culture does not have the context or the foundations to support a lot of these types of explorations. But did you have something to share there,
Yeah,
Imelda?
it's just also, it's all of those things. It's about like being authentic, but I think also safety is a really big concern for me as a teacher. I teach way out material, and I'm out there in the forest where there are wild animals. My students have spotted lynxes and wolves, while on courses with me. So I'm quite safety conscious teaching in way out locations like that. And the thing is also that a good leader for a sacred ceremony doesn't only set the boundaries, but also polices the boundaries. That's also why, say, if I run a high seat ceremony, I myself will not go on the high seat, because I am the person who's responsible for, the boundaries. Like, I'm the gatekeeper. And that is, there's a lot of work involved in that. Before I take my students into any ceremony, I spend a good 20 minutes in that space. I set boundaries. I call in spirits that I work with. I call in gatekeepers in the other world. I agree with them what portals are going to open and what portals are going to stay closed, and all of those things. And, then, with everything set right, people will have a safe and positive experience and not even realize that you could also get very close to danger if that work is not done. So my concern, if people do, like, say, an ayahuasca ceremony somewhere in a basement here in London, and they said the primary motive is to make some money, but they are not a true elder, and they haven't really learned how true elders safeguard the space and sort of also close it off in terms of the undesirable experiences and beings we do not want to climb into such a place. Then you're really opening the space, like anything could happen. And then psychosis or becoming possessed or having a really bad trip, these are all realistic outcomes. And then how is the person who holds the ceremony going to deal with those outcomes? If people end up in an ayahuasca-induced psychosis, and this happens, because I said I get emails about this, can you please go to XYZ hospital where my brother is in a ayahuasca-induced psychosis? So these are not emails I enjoy receiving. So, what level of responsibility as the person who facilitates that do you take for the experiences that people have in that space?
Yes, absolutely.
And who does the cleaning up? Who deals with the mess if it goes wrong, frankly?
Yeah, and I think, the word that comes to mind when you're speaking about all of this is integrity. And integrity is such a large piece of the puzzle when we're doing this work and navigating what that means to us. And to take a slightly different direction, because we're kind of talking about nature beings here in one sense from the plant world, but we touched on it before where, and I don't know if this has been your experience in some of your earlier learnings, but in various workshops and sessions that I've been to in the past, they do teach a lot of these, what we might consider to be core foundations of shamanism. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, the ability to cultivate these intuitive or psychic capabilities and the soul
Mm-hmm.
retrieval and the soul loss and all the rest of it. But in many of these workshops and classes, I have felt that a large piece of the puzzle that has been missing is the direct connection to nature, the land on which we live. And I mean, we look throughout so like every single shamanic tradition, and that is always such a fundamental piece. It's that deep relationship with the soil beneath our feet and the land all around us. And I guess the question that's arising here is I would love for you, if you could share a little bit about some of the nature beings that you connect with over in your forest home and what kind of relationships that
My
you've
favorite
developed.
topic.
Great, excellent. Yes, I would love to hear it.
Well, yeah, I work very closely with the spirits of the trees. Now talking about, I mean, there are beautiful trees here in London as well, but I'm now talking about my forest school in Sweden for a moment. And also like being there, spending time in nature has really helped me get to know like how all the trees are different and how, say, the silver birch tree has a very different indwelling spirit and personality than, say, an oak tree or an ash tree. And silver birch is one of my allies. Also like older trees, like our house is near a lake and the shore of the lake is lined with older trees, and they are very interesting trees that the Sami people used as well. They made substances from the older tree that they used in their ceremonies for good reason. But also just being on that land, I've had these experiences. Like a few years ago, there was one night where I was like falling asleep and I suddenly was like cradled by this animal mother who was like licking me and sniffing me, and I was like, oh, what is this? And she turned out to be the reindeer mother or the deer mother. And, you know, the sense of kind of like love and being held and the relief of dropping my humanness for a while, that I made an art video about that because it was so amazing. And suddenly sort of realizing that we human beings, we're quite anthropomorphic. We project human imagery even onto divinity and deity. But there are these really powerful, like, you know, animal gods, such as the reindeer mother. And everyone all the peoples of the circumpolar region know her in one manifestation or another, because I really researched it all the way from Greenland through Siberia and all the way around through Alaska and Canada. And they all know her. And it's like, wow, and this incredible being who is so ancient and is depicted in rock art and petroglyphs, this being came to me while I was sleeping alone in my forest house in Sweden. Or another one is that some of the Norse gods have been coming. This is usually when I'm alone at the forest house and like I don't see, like I'm on retreat, I don't see any human beings for days on end, husband and children back in London for some of the time. And also there was that one time where a very powerful being came. She was a female deity and she called herself the Poison Mother. And she would not tell me her name. So I worked with her for a year and she was really helping me like how to transmute poisons in my life, but also how I could become the crucible to transmute the poisons of the world, like using my own consciousness as the crucible or the container. And like really, really powerful stuff. And you know, she kept on coming. She wouldn't leave me alone. So I kept a journal on that, and I started making an art video because, you know, other people I felt also needed to connect to her teachings. So a year and a day literally passed because I could see it in my journal. And then finally I said, but who are you? And then she said, you have already known me for many years under another name. I'm Sigyn, and she's like Loki's wife, you know, the first wife. Well, he has children with other beings as well, but she's the wife of trickster called Loki, and at some point Loki is tied up by a cave by the goddess Skadi, and you know, he's tied down, or otherwise he'll bring on Ragnarok, like the end of the world. So Loki is tied up, and there is a poisonous snake that drips like poison on him, and Sigyn is the devoted wife who holds the dish that catches the poison, but every once in a while she has to empty the dish, and when she steps away, then, you know, Loki sort of writhes and twists and turns, and then like we have like earth shakes, the whole world is like shaking. And you know, it was so amazing. Yeah, I mean, cognitively speaking, I've known about Sigyn. She's in the stories. She's not the most prominent sort of Norse deity that one would connect to. So most people say, oh yeah, Loki's wife, and not pay her further attention. And then she came in a very modern manifestation, and she gave me all these teachings of the poison goddess. And these teachings are still rippling out in my life. I still use that in my own life. I use it for students, and it's like, wow. And that's also where I learned that the cults are evolving, because, the Sigyn I met was still very much Sigyn. But also she had been on a journey of evolving since her story was written down sort of like a millennium ago. And I think that is what's so amazing, and that's the invitation I'm trying to extend, that when we connect with these gods and goddesses, and if we strip ourselves of some of our preoccupations and filters, it's so amazing what can come through. So that's the place where I try to take my students.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I can sense now that there are going to be some people listening thinking that this is amazing, and having these types of experiences are something that they would like to cultivate on a deeper level. So I guess the obvious question here is then, what would you suggest? And of course, this is quite an expansive topic as well, but we can just keep it brief or offer a couple of suggestions. But what would you suggest when it comes to techniques, or I guess techniques maybe, or practices for connecting with the spirit world? Or, we could also language the question in terms of techniques for cultivating psychic or intuitive modes of perception.
Yeah, and I think for that, there are a lot of like courses out for that. So I think that's the way I'm going to talk about least, because, there are courses, you can go on the basic shamanic journeying, or like the courses in like intuition training. And I think that's all available. And also some of that's available online, even during the pandemic. So if you want me to speak from the Northern tradition, I would go back to the land and say, use these techniques of sitting out or even walking on the land. Use a journal and like write down, because it can be very ephemeral. You have an amazing experience, but if you don't write it down, it's going to be gone. Another huge tool in my life is dreaming, both the kind of, that I have a real, what I call a big dream that has like, meaning that takes me many weeks to unpack. And I think actually the Poison Mother came to me. That started with a dream, and it went from there. The Reindeer Mother, I was just falling asleep. That was like almost a dream as well. So like keep a dream journal, write down your dreams, and also follow up on the hints that are dropped in dreams. If you meet a really unusual being, like do the research, ask others if they have met her. But you can use intentional dreaming as well. Like say, because I'm also aware that not everyone has the good fortune of living on the land where their ancestors used to live. Like that's not a tenable statement today with the amount of like travel that goes on. And then what you can do is, before you fall asleep, set an intention. So I often dream with, say, a rune, where I ask a rune to open up and take me through a portal. Or, you could set intentions to dream with your ancestors, like, ask one of your ancestor elders to come and give you a wisdom teaching in a dream. And then maybe you'll have a dream where you're shown a particular place. And yet the dream will give you guidance on a place that you actually know in this reality, where you need to go and spend some time sitting out. Or, rather than just going to the graveyard and putting a bouquet of flowers down, like spend a longer amount of time. Bundle up warm if you're in a cold place. Here in Northern Europe, it gets cold this time of year. And then, really spend some time there. I've had my students, I don't have grave mounds in London, but, there is a very wild local cemetery. So I take people there and have students sitting out on graves. And then all the dog walkers come and say, what are all these people doing? Oh, they're my students. They're sitting out. So, go and sit out there. And if you cannot do that, if you're completely cut off from all of that, then just move your awareness. Be aware that through intention and, techniques of meditation, journeying, intuition, you can still move yourself to a place, even if you cannot be physically in that place. So move your awareness to that place. And then though maybe you're in your own whatever bedroom, but you're still like sitting out in that location, you really you pull all of your awareness there, and then listen to the bird song. Are there any smells? Does anything come to attention? Is anyone or anything or any animal moving in that landscape? Keep a journal, write it down. And if you make I mean, the first time you do it, you may have some interesting experiences, but as with most things, most spiritual techniques will give you the biggest rewards if you stick with them and if you do them repeatedly. So rather, from my point of view, rather than trying everything under the plan at once, a bit from this tradition, a bit from that teacher, oh, that's interesting too. I mean, sometimes we need to have a period where we're trying different things to see where we belong. But I think ultimately it needs to crystallize out in that we decide for ourselves that, and it can't be too many because we have our lives to lead, but choose whatever between 3 and 5, I mean, not 25, between 3 and 5 spiritual practices. For me, that would be sitting out, dreaming, working with the runes, art, of course, writing. Choose those and then really make that commitment, and then also do them when it's hard to find the time, and do them when you don't feel like it, but stick with them, because these things will only open up really big time if you commit to them. And another one I discovered recently, talking about Lent, and most people probably already know this, but I often find at this time of year when I go into the forest and I'm really keen to sort of see mushrooms, but they can be quite well hidden. Mushrooms have a way of being all around you, but you do not see them. So I discovered just recently that if I take the time to stand still and introduce myself and I say, well, my name is Imelda Almqvist, and I'd really like to know who you are, then suddenly I see 10 times more mushrooms than I did a moment before. So also, like you do with human beings, introduce yourself and ask to be in relationship. And then sometimes that request is heard, and these beings in the land step forward in a way they don't if you're just tramping across the land at a really high speed.
Those are some great suggestions, Imelda. Thank you for sharing them. So I want to be mindful of your time, and I know that we've already touched on one of your books, Sacred Art, A Hollow Bone for Spirit. I think you touched on that in the beginning.
I mentioned it, I think, yeah.
You mentioned it, yeah. But you've got your other book as well, which is Born Shamans, which is, what is it? It's all about using shamanism with young people from,
yes, that is my first
ages.
book.
Yeah.
So there are 3 books out. One got published 2 weeks ago. So Born Shamans was my first book, and I was very much guided to do spirit work with children. And I think Michael Harner, who was mentioned before, had made a statement to the effect of we should never teach children shamanic journeying, because children just they are naturally in that zone. We shouldn't tramp on their sort of innate sense of spirituality. And there is a lot to be said for that. But I think his intention was kind, but people then interpreted that as you should never do any form of shamanic work with children ever. And of course, there are many children who are in dire situations. I mean, they've lost a parent, or they're really sick, or they're going to die before their time, or even regular children, inner city, whatever, children facing bullying in school, or now we have the whole trolling and cyberbullying. I mean, there's so much that goes on. But I think leaving children to their innate spirituality without offering them a toolkit is just not fair. So that book was written from, based on years of practice working with children and teenagers, but it's based on the principle that I think it is better to offer children the opportunity to build a spiritual toolkit and give them lots of freedom how they do that, not voice the spirituality on them, but sort of create dedicated space where they engage with that, and also share with them what I think is really important. I think as a parent and as an elder, I think I owe that to the children, but to also build in the permission for them to reject it as they, grow older or as they have different ideas. But to say, well, I'm just going to do them this really big favor of not giving them any spirituality, which is something that, say, one of my brothers has done with his children. I don't think that does children any favors at all, because when they hit the rocky times, they can't fall back on it. So from my point of view, it's better to sort of help them and encourage them to build their own little spirit boat. If then later on they want a different kind of vessel or vehicle or whatever, then they can do that. But at least they're familiar with the underlying principles and they can navigate it. They can still reject every single thing I've ever taught them. That's fine. But at least they will know what spirituality is and they will know the basic workings on it. So that book is written on that basis. And it's also called session plans. Well, a lot of people, it was based on, for years, I got daily emails from all over the world where people said, oh, you know, I have a child that has this illness, or my child has bullying in school. You know, is there actually a shamanic toolkit for handling this? And I was writing so many of these emails, and it took so much of my time in. For it's easier to just like put it all together in a book. So I used all of the questions that people had asked for years. And then I sort of created a book around answering that, and sort of, you know, giving lesson plans and examples as well, so people could use that. So that book is used by colleagues, for people who do homeschooling, and, you know, like people who work with children and teenagers in any capacity. So that's Natural Born Shamans.
Yes, when I was browsing your website and I seen that, I wanted to, and I still am yet, but I will grab a copy of that because I'm very curious to have that assist me on my path of raising and guiding my 2.5-year-old daughter. So I'll certainly be acquiring that at some stage soon. But I also wanted to ask you about Medicine of the Imagination. Did you want to give a plug for that book, since it only just came out a couple of weeks ago?
I will always take a plug, you know, otherwise my publisher gets angry with me. No.
For sure.
That book was published, as I said, I think it's now 3 weeks ago, on the 30th of October. And that was a book I had not wanted to write, because I just submitted the final edits for book number 2. I thought, I'm going to go off the cliff. I'm going to go paint and, you know, have some free time, because it's quite a rigorous process writing a book. And the spirits came and said, you're going to write a 3rd book. It's called Medicine of the Imagination, and you're starting today. So today, write a contents page. So I wrote it the afternoon of the morning after I sent everything and the final edits to the editor. And then I committed to that. I said, well, what is the medicine of the imagination? So I kind of learned that while writing that book. But essentially, I now realize that I was very fortunate to be asked to do that, because the book is really about how we use our imagination as human beings, but not mindfully. So we're constantly creating all sorts of confused and even negative outcomes. So the book is really an impassioned plea for using the human imagination in such a way that we start creating that healthy, vital, functional reality that we all want, but where we cannot seem to go based on the events in our world. So the book really sort of, you know, unpicks sort of what happens if we use our imagination in like mindless ways, or in ways that we have picked up in dysfunctional families but not questioned. And, you know, every chapter then has a chapter activity. But I'm trying to take people to the place of that, if it is our collective desire to create a much healthier reality for ourselves and our children, also a reality that really honors the land and the environment, we are going to have to use our imagination in a different way. So that went to the publisher a year ago, got published recently, and now we're in the pandemic, and, you know, COVID has arrived on the scene. And like, I thought, you know, actually, I've just written a book that really addresses a lot of the COVID questions. But, you know, I finished it a year ago. I wasn't told that COVID was coming, but I still think I've written a book that offers a toolkit for dealing with a lot of the difficult issues we face today. So I can now understand why the spirits demanded I wrote it then, because I said, yeah, maybe one day. And they said, not one day, you're going to write it now. And I'm clear that I did.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I'm interested in picking up a copy of that as well. But
one at a time.
I'm laughing at myself because I keep adding books to the list of books to read, and as you know, that we're in the warmer months over here in Australia, so the garden is blossoming and the garden, the grass is growing and all the rest of it. But I'm about 75 to 80% through my first manuscript of the first book that I'm writing.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it's exciting, but it's also something that I started during the winter months when we lived at our previous property, when I had a lot more time to sit down and engage in the writing process. So I'm finding it quite challenging in between the podcasting and the editing and all the technological upkeep to kind of carve out that space within the day to get back into the writing process. I'm just laughing at myself adding more projects to the list when I know that Spirit's trying to pull me back to finish this damn manuscript.
But, you know, writing is also a spiritual practice. Like, you know, if I don't know, it's not for me to, you know, work out how your life works. But I think For me, painting and writing have to be daily spiritual practices, because like if I don't do them, I don't feel optimal. Like I feel better when I do it. It's not even that I have to do it, but like I feel better if I make time for these things in my life. And sometimes that's as little as 5 minutes. I'll sit in my bed at night if I haven't painted or written at all, and I'll just scribble 4 lines for a quick poem in my art diary. But then I've still met my own agreement with myself that there's going to be some writing in my day, you know.
Mm-hmm. No, I know the feeling very well, and I certainly go through stages of that, and I'm feeling myself getting back into that stage of feeling like I'm sacrificing a part of myself by not sacrificing the time that I'm spending elsewhere to come back. But yeah, it's like it's ebbing and flowing with the rhythms of the land and the changing of the seasons,
Yeah.
as we know. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So I guess as we start to wrap things up then, I know we've spoken about everything that's happening at the moment on the worldwide level with the pandemic, and you've shifted some of your offerings to the online space. So did you want to speak about any of your current offerings or projects that are happening at the moment?
Well, what I could just mention, I've talked about the 1-year program for Rune magicians, which is quite popular at the moment, like a large number of students there, and it's growing. But I also have started an online school because I consider myself very much an in-person teacher because of the love for the land. But I mean, you know, life is what it is. So in September, I opened an online school called Pregnant Hag Teachings, which is on the teachable side. And at the moment, nearly all my offerings are there. And, you know, and nearly all of it is like through Zoom, like doing webinars. So I figure I'll use the pandemic to sort of, you know, work in that way, because also I have many students in the US and all over Europe, other locations as well, who kind of stuck, like we're halfway through a 2-year program. Or, you know, I should have been in the US last week, like teaching programs for Rune magicians, but of course I couldn't travel. So I'm now offering some of that online also, so I can continue to work with the students and not leave them abandoned that suddenly they're stuck without anything. But I'm very much hoping in a year's time or so to be back to working online and traveling around again, like connecting with people in person. But if people want to check out what I'm doing, if you Google Pregnant Hag Teachings, or people can send me an email and be added to my mailing list if they want to receive an occasional update. That's possible as well.
Okay, great. And I'll have all of the links to your website and to everything else in the show notes. But for those who are tuning in now and who want to jump over to your website from memory, it is www.shaman-
Healer, shaman healer painter. So www.shaman- healer-painter.com. I mean, I made that website more, you know, I was still a student of shamanism thinking, oh yeah, I'll just like make it. I had no idea it would become a kind of global phenomenon. And if I made that website today, it'd have a different name, but there you go. I can't really change it so easily anymore. So it's not an ideal name, but yeah, that's what it's called.
Yeah, cool. Okay, great. Yeah, people can follow that up in the show notes. So I got 2 last questions for you then, Imelda. So this is a pretty broad question, a general question. What are you most curious about right now?
How we are collectively accept the teachings, the teachings that have been offered by the pandemic. Like, I feel that in the pandemic, there is a huge invitation to permanently change our ways, and not all of those changes are going to be comfortable. And as I said, no false positivity, because like many people have died or are desperately ill. So I'm not even going to say that's all very positive. I mean, a lot of it is terribly negative, has impacted people in incredibly destructive ways. But also, I think on another level, I think something had to be done concerning the course that humanity was set on. So I think it's a huge invitation. I think there was already a virus before we had a pandemic, and that virus was Wetiko, kind of like, well, that requires a whole explanation, but like, you know, Wetiko is the sort of, in a way, kind of almost like the evil that's in every human being, the capacity for evil. It's like the part of us that thinks it is okay that other people or beings or land, that anything other than us pays the price for the things that I am going to have, that it's okay to sort of just take the inherent life force or the body of something that is not me. So it's about how we are in relationship with the world. So I think think so. So that is the thing I'm really curious about, and I think that's the edge, the cutting edge where I'm trying to chip away, and I try to weave that into my courses. And also, I'm really deeply curious to see what young people are going to do. And I think my closing comment would be, can we please bring back rites of passage for young people? Can we please properly, spiritually speaking, mentor young people again, so they actually are going to have the toolkit and the support to create the world that now needs creating, where we don't mindlessly keep running programming that's really, really old and serves no more. But young people are going to need our support. They can't do it on their own.
Yeah, absolutely. And that is a vortex, a portal that we could enter right there when it comes to rites of passage. But I think this is a good place to wrap it up. And I just want to extend my thanks, Imelda, for coming on and having this conversation. And thank you for being generous with your time and sharing
Well,
all of your
thank you for
knowledge and your
having me.
wisdom.
It's been a delight to talk to you. And you've written me all these poetic emails about your location. So I was really looking forward to talking to you in person now. And so we've done.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, well, are there any very last final words that you want to leave our listeners or viewers with any reflections, insights, words of wisdom as a final parting gift?
I think, don't give up and dare be your authentic self in the world. Like, don't get boxed in ideas other people have of what you should be. Like, be brave enough to, like, the world needs the unique medicine that is you, and that is the authentic you. It's not the you that has been sort of put into a box and tied up so it pleases other people. It's like, in a way, more your feral, wild, authentic self that the world needs right now. So we, all of us together, can be the medicine that our world needs right now. That's my wish.
Beautiful. Yes, I'll hold that vision and that prayer as well. Yeah, thanks again, Imelda.